The stagecoach bucked and swayed, a wooden cage rattling over an endless expanse of sun-scorched earth, where the air shimmered like water and the red sand glowed under the sun. Inside, Jack Calder sat wedged between a sweat-stained preacher and a portly salesman whose breath smelled of stale whiskey. He kept his gaze fixed on the window, watching the distant mesas burn crimson and gold against the horizon. For 3 days, this had been his world. The groan of leather, the rhythmic clatter of hooves, and the suffocating dust that coated his tongue and settled in the lines of his face. He was a man running from a ghost, but the faster he ran, the larger its shadow loomed. His hand went to his breast pocket, a gesture so reflexive he no longer noticed it. His fingers brushed against the cool, smooth surface of the silver locket. Inside was the only picture he had of Eleanor, her smile frozen in time, a memory he polished daily in his mind, until it shone brighter than the truth. That locket was his compass, his penance, his last connection to the man he used to be, a U.S. Marshal with a star on his chest, and a belief in the simple clarity of justice. A stray bullet in Wichita had shattered that clarity, taking Eleanor and leaving Jack with a wound that would not close. Now he was just Jack Calder, a man heading for the remote town of Silver Creek, seeking a quiet place to let his past finally bury him. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the afternoon stupor. Dust exploded. Wood splintered. A bullet sang past his ear. The coach lurched violently, throwing the salesman into the preacher's lap. Outside, the driver's curse was cut short by a choked cry. Hooves screamed, and the world tilted sideways as the stagecoach ground to a halt, one wheel splintered and useless. "Everybody out," a voice snarled from the swirling dust. "Hands high where I can see 'em." Jack's training screamed at him to act. His hand instinctively twitched toward the Colt peacemaker tucked in his belt, but he held back. That life was over. He was no longer the law. He was just a passenger, another victim. He raised his hands, his face a mask of weary resignation, and followed the others out into the blinding sunlight. 4 riders emerged from the dust, their faces hidden behind grimy bandanas. They were professionals moving with a cold efficiency that spoke of long practice. One covered the terrified passengers with a rifle, while the others methodically ransacked the coach and the luggage boot. They worked fast, grabbing mailbags and strongboxes. Wallets, jewelry. Now the leader barked, his eyes sweeping over the small, trembling group. The salesman fumbled with his pockets, dropping a gold watch. The preacher began to pray under his breath. Jack slowly reached for his wallet, his movements deliberate, non-threatening. But the leader's gaze snagged on him, a flicker of recognition in his cold eyes that made the hairs on Jack's neck stand up. This wasn't random. The man strode forward, ignoring the others, his boots crunching on the rocky ground. He stopped directly in front of Jack. "You?" "Calder." Jack's blood ran cold. He said nothing, his face impassive. "Heard you were coming this way." The bandit said, his voice a low growl. He wasn't looking at Jack's wallet. His eyes were fixed on Jack's chest. With a sudden vicious move, he ripped open Jack's coat, the buttons scattering in the dust. His gloved hand plunged into Jack's breast pocket and emerged with the silver locket. A raw, primal rage ignited in Jack's gut. "No," he rasped, the word torn from his throat. He took a step forward. The bandit's pistol was a blur of motion. The butt of it crashed against Jack's temple. The world erupted in a flash of white-hot pain, and Jack crumpled to the ground, the taste of blood and dust in his mouth. Through a swimming haze, he saw the bandit hold the locket up, the silver glinting in the sun. He didn't open it. He didn't look at the picture. He simply pocketed it, as if collecting a preordained debt. "That's all we came for," the leader said to his men. They mounted their horses, the stolen mailbags and strongboxes forgotten on the ground. This was never about money. It was about him. It was about the locket. As they spurred their horses and vanished back into the shimmering heat, Jack pushed himself onto his elbows, his head pounding. The world spun, but one image remained burned into his vision, the glint of that silver locket in a thief's hand. They had taken more than a memento. They had stolen the last piece of his wife, the last piece of his soul. The quiet life he had sought in Silver Creek was a fantasy. He wasn't running from his past anymore. It had ridden out to meet him. Silver Creek wasn't so much a town as a scar on the face of the desert, a collection of sun-bleached buildings huddled together as if for protection against the vast, indifferent emptiness that surrounded them. Dust fine as powdered bone coated everything, the leaning facade of the saloon and the silent anvil in the blacksmith's shop and the weary faces of the few people who shuffled along the boardwalk. The air, thick with the smell of dust and horse sweat, carried a tension that was almost visible, a shimmering unease that had nothing to do with the heat. Jack Calder, his head bandaged and his soul scraped raw, walked his horse down the main street. He'd spent a day and a night walking from the wreck of the stagecoach, his thirst a living thing in his throat, his rage a cold, hard knot in his belly. He had come here seeking oblivion, but the targeted theft of Eleanor's locket had given him a new terrible purpose. He scanned the faces of the townsfolk. They moved with their heads down, their eyes averted, avoiding his gaze, as if looking at a stranger was a crime. This was a town choked by fear, and Jack knew with the certainty of a man who had spent a decade reading the signs that one man was responsible. His name, he learned from a tight-lipped stable hand, was Silas Kane, a man who had arrived 6 months ago with a fat wallet and a smile that never reached his eyes. He was buying up everything: ranches, water rights, businesses, paying pennies on the dollar to owners who were suddenly beset by a string of misfortunes: fires, diseased cattle, dried up wells. Kane's offers, once seen as generous, were now understood as threats. Jack found his way to the sheriff's office. A portly man with a drooping mustache and food stains on his star sat with his boots on his desk, snoring softly. He introduced himself as Sheriff Brody. "Stagecoach robbery." Brody grunted, barely opening his eyes. "Happens. Rough country." "They knew my name," Jack said, his voice flat. "They took one thing, a locket, left the mailbags and the strongbox." Brody's eyes finally opened. A flicker of something, fear maybe, or just profound weariness, passed through them. He swung his boots off the desk. "Mister, some things in this valley are best left alone. You got here alive. Count your blessings and ride on." "I'm not riding on," Jack said. The words were quiet, but they hung in the small, stuffy office with the weight of an oath. He left the sheriff to his slumber and walked toward the saloon, the only building in town that seemed to show any signs of life. As he pushed through the swinging doors, a hush fell over the room. Every eye turned to him, the stranger with the bandaged head and the hard, unreadable face. He ignored them, walking to the bar and ordering a whiskey. He was nursing the drink, letting the burn of it cut through his exhaustion, when he felt a presence beside him. He turned to see a woman. She was tall and slender, with sun-streaked brown hair pulled back from a face that was all sharp angles and stubborn pride. Her hands were calloused, her dress practical and worn, but her eyes, dark and intelligent, held a fire that the rest of this town seemed to have lost. "You're the man from the stagecoach," she said. It wasn't a question. Jack nodded, saying nothing. "Word travels fast," she continued, her voice low but clear. "They say the robbers weren't interested in money. They say they were after you." "They got what they wanted," Jack replied, his gaze dropping to his empty hands on the bar. "My name is Elena Rios," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, honest. "I own the 3 Creeks Ranch north of here." Jack Calder, "I know," she said, and he saw a flicker of sympathy in her eyes. "Sheriff Brody is useless. He's on Kane's payroll like most everyone else who holds a position of authority in this town." "Silas Kane," Jack said, testing the name. "He's the one squeezing this town dry." "He's trying," Elena corrected him. "He wants my land. It has the last reliable spring in this valley. So far, I've refused to sell." She paused, her gaze steady. "Which is why my barn caught fire last week, and my fences were cut 2 nights ago." A boy of about 7 years old with Elena's dark eyes and a smudge of dirt on his cheek peeked around her skirts. He clutched a small wooden horse in his hand. "This is my son, Miguel," Elena said, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. Jack looked from the boy's innocent face to Elena's defiant one. He saw the same fight in her that he once had in himself. He also saw her fear the deep, gnawing terror of a parent trying to protect her child in a world without law. "You should sell," Jack said, his voice harsher than he intended. "Take the boy and go. This place, it's not worth dying for." He was speaking to her, but the words were a bitter admonition to himself. Eleanor had died for nothing. Elena's spine stiffened. "This land was my husband's, his father's before him. It's my son's birthright. I won't be scared off my property by a snake like Silas Kane. Some things are worth fighting for, Mr. Calder." Her words struck a nerve, a painful echo of a belief he thought he'd buried. He turned back to his whiskey, his reflection in the bar mirror, showing a stranger, a hollowed-out man he no longer recognized. He wanted no part of her fight. He had his own ghosts to hunt. That night, Jack took a room above the saloon. Sleep wouldn't come. He lay on the lumpy mattress, the sounds of shouting and a tinny piano drifting up from below, and saw the bandit's eyes, the glint of silver, Eleanor's stolen face. Who were they? Why target him? The questions circled like vultures. Around midnight, a different sound cut through the noise, the frantic ringing of a fire bell. Jack was on his feet in an instant, pulling on his boots and grabbing his gun belt. From his window, he could see it, an angry orange glow lighting up the sky to the north, toward the Three Creeks Ranch. He didn't hesitate. He was down the stairs and on his horse in less than a minute, galloping out of the sleeping town. The man who wanted to be left alone was gone. In his place was the marshal, the man who ran toward the fire, not away from it. When he reached the ranch, the barn was a raging inferno. Flames licked at the night sky, sending a column of black smoke billowing into the stars. Elena was a silhouette against the blaze, frantically trying to lead a panicked horse from a nearby corral. Miguel clinging to her skirts, crying. 2 men on horseback, their faces masked by shadows, were circling the main house, torches in their hands. Jack didn't shout a warning. He didn't fire a shot into the air. He drew his Colt, took aim, and fired. Dust exploded. Wood splintered. A bullet sang past his ear. His first shot clipped the arm of one of the riders, sending his torch spinning into the dirt. The man screamed, clutching his arm. The second rider turned, leveling a rifle. Jack fired again. The man tumbled from his saddle, a dark stain spreading on his chest. The wounded rider spurred his horse and fled into the darkness. Silence descended, broken only by the roar of the fire and the terrified sobs of the little boy. Jack swung down from his horse, his gun still smoking in his hand. The feel of it was an old, familiar ache. He walked toward Elena, who was staring at him, her face smudged with soot, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and gratitude. "You were saying some things are worth fighting for, Jack?" said his voice a low rasp. Elena could only nod, pulling her son closer. Jack looked from the burning barn to the dark, empty prairie where the rider had fled. He knew then that his path and Elena's had merged. Silas Kane had not only stolen his past, He had just declared war on his future. For the first time in 3 years, Jack Calder knew exactly who he was. He was the man who was going to burn Cain's world to the ground. The dawn broke gray and grim, revealing the full extent of the devastation. The barn was a smoldering skeleton, its blackened timbers reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The smell of ash and ruin hung heavy in the air. Elena Rios stood amidst the wreckage, her face a mask of weary resolve, her son Miguel holding her hand, his small face streaked with tears and soot. Jack had spent the rest of the night helping her move the spooked livestock to a makeshift pen and ensuring no stray embers threatened the house. They had worked in a silence born of shared exhaustion and an unspoken understanding. By intervening, Jack had cast his lot with her. He was no longer a transient ghost passing through. He was an obstacle in Silas Cain's path. "He won't stop," Elena said, her voice flat as she stared at the ruins. This was a message. "I'll be here when he sends the next one," Jack replied. He looked down at the body of the man he'd shot. He rolled him over. The face was unremarkable, a hired gun with greedy eyes, now vacant and staring. There was nothing on him to identify who he worked for, but they both knew. He spent the morning digging a grave on a barren patch of land far from the house. The work was hard, the ground unforgiving. Each shovelful of dirt was an act of penance, a reminder of the life he'd tried to leave behind. As he worked, Miguel watched him from a distance, the boy's initial fear slowly giving way to a cautious curiosity. Later that day, Sheriff Brody rode out his horse, kicking up lazy clouds of dust. He surveyed the scene with a practiced air of indifference. "Looks like you had some trouble, Mrs. Rios," he said, not dismounting. "2 of Cain's men tried to burn down my house." Elena stated, her voice sharp with accusation. "Mr. Calder stopped them." Brody's eyes shifted to Jack, a flicker of annoyance in his gaze. "You got a habit of finding trouble, Calder. I find one dead man on this property that makes you a killer. Maybe I ought to run you in." "You do what you have to, Sheriff," Jack said calmly, not breaking his stare. "But you and I both know who sent these men. You want to arrest someone, ride out to the Cain ranch and arrest the man who pays for the torches." A tense silence stretched between them. Brody's hand rested near his pistol, but he made no move. He was a dog on a short leash, and he knew it. Finally, he spat on the ground. "This is your last warning, Calder. Stay out of things that ain't your concern." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and complicity in his wake. Days turned into a week. Jack stayed at the ranch, his presence a silent deterrent. He helped Elena with the chores, his hands once accustomed only to the weight of a gun, relearning the feel of an axe handle and leather reins. He mended fences, cleared debris, and kept watch through the long, quiet nights. He spoke little, but Elena seemed to understand his silence. They were 2 wounded people finding a strange comfort in each other's orbits. He saw the toll the constant threat was taking on her. He saw it in the dark circles under her eyes, in the way she'd startle at the sound of a horse approaching. Yet she never wavered. She worked from sunup to sundown, her determination a force of nature. And he watched Miguel, who slowly began to see Jack, not as a threat, but as a protector. The boy would follow him around, asking quiet questions about his horse, or simply sit and watch him carve a piece of wood into a small animal. The next attack was not one of fire and bullets, but of insidious, creeping death. One morning, Elena came back from the spring, her face pale with dread. "The creek," she said, her voice trembling. "It's dry. Just a trickle of mud." Jack rode out with her. The stream that was the lifeblood of her ranch, the very reason Cain coveted the land, had been reduced to a pathetic dribble. He followed it upstream for 2 miles beyond her property line. There he found the cause, a crudely built but effective dam of rock and timber, diverting the entire flow of water onto Kane's adjacent land. It was a death sentence for the Three Creeks Ranch. Without water, her cattle would die. Her land would turn to dust. She would be ruined. "He's going to choke us out," Elena whispered, her shoulders slumping in the first sign of defeat Jack had seen from her. "No," Jack said, his voice hard. "He's not." He looked at the dam and then at the surrounding hills. "My grandfather used to tell me stories about this part of the country. Said there were old springs up in the high country, forgotten ones the Apache used. If we can find one, we can dig a new channel down to your land." It was a desperate gamble. The high country was treacherous, a maze of canyons and rock falls, and they had no map. But it was the only hope they had. "It's too dangerous," Elena protested, "and I can't leave Miguel." "I'll go," Jack said. "Alone, you'll die of thirst before you find anything." "No. We go together." She looked toward the ranch house where Miguel was playing in the yard. "Mrs. Gable from the next ranch over. Her husband sold out to Kane, but she hates him for it. She'll watch Miguel for a few days. She owes me a favor." And so 2 days later, they set out at dawn, 2 pack mules laden with water, food, and digging tools. They rode north into the jagged, sun-blasted hills that loomed over the valley. The journey was brutal. The sun was a hammer, the landscape a vast, hostile expanse of rock and cactus. They spoke little, conserving their energy, communicating through glances and gestures. On the second day, as they navigated a narrow canyon, Jack felt the hair on his neck prickle. The feeling of being watched. He motioned for Elena to halt, his hand resting on his colt. The silence was absolute, save for the buzz of insects. Then he saw a glint of sunlight on metal high up on the canyon rim. A rifle barrel. "Get down," he yelled, shoving Elena from her horse and pulling her behind a cluster of boulders. A shot rang out, the bullet ricocheting off the rock near his head with a high-pitched scream. They were pinned down. 2 of Kane's men sent to make sure their desperate search failed. "They have the high ground," Elena breathed, her face pressed against the warm rock. "Stay here," Jack ordered. He studied the rock face, his marshal's eye, calculating angles and possibilities. He saw a narrow, almost invisible fissure leading upward away from the shooter's line of sight. It would be a hard climb, but it was their only chance. He moved, a blur of motion scrambling from their cover and into the fissure. The gunman, surprised by his move, fired a volley of shots that chipped away at the rock around him. He ignored them, pulling himself up, his boots finding purchase on the smallest of ledges, his fingers raw and bleeding. He was no longer just Jack Calder, the broken ranch hand. He was Marshall Calder, a man who knew how to turn the terrain into a weapon. He reached the top of the ridge well behind the 2 ambushers. They were still focused on the boulders below, waiting for him to show himself. They never heard him coming. He moved like a wraith, his colt a steady cold weight in his hand. The confrontation was swift and brutal. When it was over, 2 more of Kane's men lay dead in the high desert sun. He found Elena where he had left her, her rifle held tight, her face pale but her eyes blazing. "Are you?" she started to ask. "I'm fine," he said, his voice rough. He looked at his hands stained with dust and blood. This was the violence he had tried to escape, the part of himself he hated. But it had just saved her life. It had saved their hope. They pressed on. The next evening, just as their water was running low and despair was beginning to set in, Jack saw it. A patch of vibrant green, nestled in a small, hidden basin high in the hills, a clutch of cottonwood trees, an impossible splash of life in the middle of the desolation. They urged their tired mounts forward, and as they drew closer, they heard it, the faint, miraculous sound of trickling water. The spring was small, but it was steady, bubbling up from deep within the earth. It was cool, clear, and life-giving. Elena knelt, plunging her hands into the small pool, a sob of pure relief escaping her lips. Jack watched her, a strange feeling stirring in his chest. It was more than just the success of their mission. Seeing the hope return to her face, he felt a flicker of it in himself. They had found the water. They had survived Kane's attack. For the first time, Jack felt like they weren't just reacting, but fighting back. Their bond, forged in shared danger and desperation, had deepened into something more. They were no longer just a rancher and a drifter. They were partners, allies. And in the quiet of that hidden basin, surrounded by the vast, silent wilderness, Jack realized he was no longer fighting just for the memory of his dead wife. He was fighting for the life of the woman kneeling before him and for the future of her son. Returning to the ranch with the promise of water felt like a monumental victory. But Jack knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Kane would not be deterred by the loss of a few men. He was playing a bigger game, and Jack was determined to understand the rules. He began to ride into Silver Creek more often, not as a drifter, but as an investigator. He spent hours in the saloon listening to the hushed gossip of ranchers who had lost their land and cowboys who had taken Kane's coin. He pieced together a pattern. Kane wasn't just buying land connected to Elena's. He was acquiring properties that seemed random, worthless, a dried-up mine, a barren stretch of alkali, flat a defunct freight office. But when Jack mapped them out, he saw it. The properties formed a jagged line, tracing the path of the old Wichita mail route, a route Jack had patrolled for 5 years as a marshal. And the people Kane was pushing out, Old Man Hemlock, who lost his farm to a suspicious blight, had once been a witness for the prosecution in a trial Jack had overseen. The Gables, who sold their ranch after their well was poisoned, had provided Jack with shelter when he was tracking the Miller gang. Every move Kane made seemed connected, however tenuously, to Jack's old life. The realization settled in his gut like a shard of ice. This wasn't about land or water. It was an intricate, patient web, and he was the fly it had been built to catch. He started digging into Kane's finances, sending a coded telegram to a former colleague in the Marshal's service. The reply that came a week later confirmed his suspicions. Silas Kane was spending a fortune, far more than the land was worth, even with the water rights. He was hemorrhaging money. This wasn't an investment, it was an obsession. One evening, Jack followed one of Kane's foremen, a brutish man named Colby, from the saloon. He cornered him in the dark alley behind the blacksmith shop. Colby was big and mean, but Jack moved with a speed and precision that came from 1,000 desperate fights. The fight was short and one-sided. Jack pressed the cold barrel of his Colt against the man's temple. "I want some answers," he said, his voice a low growl. "The stagecoach robbery. Who gave the order?" Colby, his face a bloody mess, just spat. "Go to hell, Calder." Jack's thumb cocked the hammer. The click was deafening in the narrow alley. "I've been there. Who gave the order?" Fear finally broke through the man's bravado. "Kane," he croaked. "It was always Kane. He wanted you brought to Silver Creek. He wanted that locket." Jack's hand tightened on the gun. "Why?" "I don't know. He just said it was personal." Colby's eyes darted to Jack's coat pocket. He wanted this back too. The foreman fumbled inside his own jacket and pulled out a small, familiar object. It glinted in the sliver of moonlight. The silver locket. Jack snatched it, his heart pounding against his ribs. He stared at it, the blood draining from his face. It was real. Eleanor's face was safe inside. He had it back. He looked at Colby, then at the locket. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The stagecoach robbery was a summons. They hadn't taken the locket to keep it. They had taken it to ensure he would stay, to guarantee he would come looking for answers, to anchor him in Silver Creek, right where Silas Kane wanted him. The conflict wasn't just connected to his past. It was a direct confrontation with it. It was, as Colby had said, personal. He let Colby go, watching the man stumble away into the darkness. He walked back to his horse in a daze, the locket clutched in his hand. The initial wave of relief at its recovery was drowned by a cold rising tide of dread. Who was Silas Kane? Why this elaborate, cruel charade? What debt did Kane believe he was owed? He rode back to the Three Creeks Ranch under a starless sky, the weight of the locket in his pocket 100 times heavier than before. It was no longer just a symbol of his lost love. It was a piece of bait. When he arrived, the ranch house was dark and quiet. He unsaddled his horse and walked to the porch, his mind racing. Elena emerged from the shadows, a rifle in her hands. She lowered it when she saw it was him. "You were gone a long time," she said, her voice soft with worry. He didn't answer. He simply opened his hand and showed her the locket. Her eyes widened. "You found it." She reached out, her fingers brushing against his, a simple, warm touch that sent a jolt through him. "Jack, this is wonderful." "No," he said, his voice rough with a terrible certainty. "It's not. It's a message." He explained what he had learned, the pattern of Kane's land purchases, the connection to his old life, the confirmation from the foreman. He told her how the robbery had been a lure. Elena listened, her expression growing grave. The joy on her face was replaced by a deep understanding of the danger they were in. "He's been hunting you," she whispered, "and using you to do it." Jack said, the guilt a bitter taste in his mouth. "Your ranch, your water. It was all just a way to pin me here, to force my hand." "He underestimated us," Elena said, her chin lifting with that familiar stubborn pride. "He thought I would break. He thought you would run. He doesn't know us." "He knows me," Jack countered. "Or he thinks he does. He knows my past, and he's using it like a weapon." That night, sleep offered no escape. Jack was haunted by nightmares, fragmented images of his life as a marshal. The faces of outlaws, the scent of gunpowder, the final bloody gunfight in Wichita. He woke in a cold sweat, the name of the man he'd killed in that fight on his lips, a young, reckless outlaw named Marcus Thorne. He'd shot Thorne in a dusty street, and a stray bullet from Thorne's gun had struck Eleanor as she came out of a dry goods store. It was the event that had broken him the moment his belief in justice had died. He lit a lamp and opened the locket. He stared at Eleanor's smiling face. But for the first time, the image brought no comfort. It was a relic of a life built on a lie. The lie that he could outrun his own violence. Silas Kane was proving that lie wrong. The next morning, the other shoe dropped. Mrs. Gable rode up to the ranch, her face frantic with panic. "It's Miguel," she cried, breathless. "He was playing by the creek." A man rode up, a well-dressed man on a black stallion. He spoke to Miguel, then he scooped him up and rode off. "He said to tell you that Mr. Kane would like to settle his debt with Mr. Calder. He said to come to his ranch, alone." The world stopped. The air left Jack's lungs. He looked at Elena. The color had drained from her face, her expression a canvas of pure terror. Kane had taken her son. He had taken the one thing she couldn't lose, the one thing Jack had sworn to protect. The game was over. The patient, cruel trap had been sprung. Kane had taken his bait, and now he was demanding a confrontation on his terms at a time and place of his choosing. Jack's past had finally caught up to him, and it was threatening to consume the only future he had dared to imagine. A preternatural stillness had fallen over the valley, the air thick and heavy, charged with an oppressive energy. The sky to the west was a bruised, sickly yellow, the color of old parchment. A sandstorm was coming. The wind began to pick up, whining through the eaves of the ranch house, carrying with it the first biting grains of sand. Elena was packing ammunition into a saddlebag, her hands moving with a feverish, mechanical precision. Her face was a pale, taut mask of terror, but her eyes burned with a mother's righteous fury. "I'm going with you," she said, her voice tight and brittle. "No," Jack said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He checked the action on his Colt, the metallic click sharp and final in the tense silence. "This is my fight. He wants me. He has my son." She shot back her control, finally cracking. "Miguel." "Jack, I can't just sit here and wait." He moved to her, gripping her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were cold, hard chips of granite. "And what will you do? Ride into the heart of his ranch with a rifle? He has a dozen men. You'll be killed before you get within a mile of Miguel. Your son needs you alive. You have to trust me." The words were harsh, but they were the truth. Tears welled in Elena's eyes, but she bit them back, nodding slowly. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a desperate, soul-crushing fear. "Bring him home, Jack," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please just bring him home." He placed the silver locket in her hand and closed her fingers around it. "Keep this safe for me," he said. It was a promise. He would be back. He rode out into the rising wind, a solitary figure against the ominous, churning sky. The world was losing its color, everything dissolving into a monochrome haze of swirling dust and sand. The wind howled, a physical force that tore at his clothes and stung his eyes. Visibility dropped to mere feet. The sandstorm wasn't just weather. It was a shroud, a perfect environment for a ghost to go hunting. Kane's ranch was a fortress, its main house a sprawling adobe structure surrounded by a high wall. As Jack approached, the storm hit with full fury. Sand scoured the landscape, reducing the world to a maelstrom of noise and grit. He dismounted, leaving his horse in a sheltered arroyo, and approached the compound on foot, using the storm as cover. The guards on the wall were huddled against the gale, their senses useless in the blinding chaos. He scaled the wall like a phantom, dropping silently into the courtyard within. The ranch was an eerie oasis of calm in the heart of the storm. The main house stood silent, its windows dark, save for a single lantern glowing in an upper-floor room. Jack moved through the screaming wind, a ghost in his own right, his Colt steady in his hand. He entered the house through an unlocked kitchen door, the silence within a stark contrast to the elemental fury raging outside. He moved up the stairs, his boots making no sound on the wooden steps. The only light came from under the door at the end of the hall. He kicked it open. The room was a lavish study lined with books and furnished with a large oak desk. Silas Kane stood by the window, looking out at the storm, a glass of brandy in his hand. He was tall and impeccably dressed, his calm demeanor a chilling counterpoint to the violence of the moment. Miguel sat in a large armchair, silent and wide-eyed, a half-eaten apple in his lap. He was unharmed. Kane turned, and his lips curved into a thin, predatory smile. "Mr. Calder." "Punctual. I expected nothing less from a man of your reputation." "Let the boy go, Kane." Jack said, his voice a low growl, his pistol leveled at Kane's heart. "All in due time," Kane said smoothly, taking a sip of his brandy. He gestured to a chair. "Please. We have so much to discuss. You and I have a history, you see." He walked to a small table and picked up a single pressed flower preserved under glass. It was a prairie rose, Eleanor's favorite. Beautiful, aren't they? My late sister-in-law was quite fond of them. Jack's blood ran cold. What are you talking about? Kane's smile widened a chilling, triumphant expression. My name is Silas Kane Thorne. Does the name Thorne ring any bells for you, Marshall? The world tilted. Thorne, the name from his nightmares. Marcus Thorne, the outlaw he'd killed in Wichita. Marcus was my younger brother Kane, said his voice dropping, losing its educated veneer and taking on a raw, venomous edge. He was foolish, reckless, but he was my blood. You shot him down in the street like a dog. For that a debt is owed. Everything crashed into place. The targeted robbery, the land purchases, the patient, cruel orchestration of his ruin. It was all for this. A vendetta. This has all been for revenge. Jack breathed, his mind reeling. Revenge is such a crude word, Kane sneered. I prefer poetic justice. I wanted to take everything from you just as you took everything from me. My brother, my family's name, our future. I used my inheritance to buy this valley, to create this stage all for you. I wanted to ruin you, financially, break you emotionally, and only then, when you were truly alone and hopeless, would I kill you. He paused, letting the weight of his obsession fill the room. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, a chorus to his madness. But you proved more resilient than I anticipated, Kane continued. And you found a new family. His gaze flickered to Miguel. So I was forced to accelerate my plans. But before we conclude our business, there is one last truth you must understand. One final piece of the poem. He stepped toward Jack, his eyes gleaming with a feverish intensity. You've spent 3 years mourning your sainted wife, Eleanor, worshipping at the altar of her memory. You carry her picture in that locket like a holy relic. But did you ever wonder what she was doing in that part of Wichita, meeting my brother? Jack stared at him, uncomprehending. What? Oh yes, Kane hissed, savoring every word. Your Eleanor wasn't an innocent bystander killed by a stray bullet. She was Marcus's lover. She was feeding him information about your patrols, your movements. The Miller gang knew where to strike because your wife told them. Her death wasn't a tragic accident, Marshall. It was the price of her own betrayal. Marcus's last shot wasn't stray. He was trying to silence her before she could talk. The words struck Jack with the force of a physical blow. A lie. His entire grief, his guilt, the very foundation of his broken life, all of it, was built on a lie. He saw Eleanor's face in his mind, not as the smiling angel in the locket, but as a stranger, a deceiver. The pain was so immense, so soul-shattering, that his gun hand wavered for a fraction of a second. It was the opening Kane had been waiting for. He lunged not at Jack, but at the heavy oak desk, shoving it with all his might. The desk crashed into Jack, sending him stumbling backward. A hidden derringer appeared in Kane's hand. He fired. The shot went wide as Jack twisted away the bullet, burying itself in the doorframe. The study exploded into chaos. Jack kicked the desk aside and fired back. Kane dove behind the overturned furniture. Miguel screamed and scrambled under the armchair. Outside, the storm raged, the groan of the ranch house timbers mingling with the roar of gunfire. A lantern shattered, plunging the room into a disorienting gloom, lit only by the strobing flashes of their pistols. Shadows danced. Glass shattered. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Jack used the darkness, his training taking over. He moved, firing, then moving again, making himself an impossible target. Kane was good, but he was fueled by hatred. Jack was fueled by something more primal now, the desperate need to save the boy, the last anchor of truth in a world of lies. He caught a glimpse of Cain reloading behind the armchair where Miguel was hiding. In that instant, Jack didn't hesitate. He threw himself forward, a deliberate target drawing Cain's fire. A bullet seared across his ribs, a line of fire, but it gave him the opening he needed. He fired his last 2 shots. The first struck Cain in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second struck him square in the chest. Silas Cain Thorne crumpled to the floor, the derringer clattering from his grasp. A look of profound shock was etched on his face, the face of a man whose perfectly crafted poem had ended with the wrong line. Silence descended, absolute and deafening. The only sound was the howling wind and Jack's own ragged breathing. He stumbled to his feet, clutching his side, and went to the armchair. "Miguel," he said, his voice gentle, "it's over. You're safe." The boy peeked out, his eyes wide with terror. Jack reached out a hand. After a long moment, Miguel took it, his small fingers wrapping around Jack's blood-stained ones. The connection was real. Solid. True. Jack led the boy from the room of shadows and death, leaving the architect of his long nightmare to the judgment of the storm. The sandstorm had passed by the time Jack rode back into the yard of the Three Creeks Ranch, leaving the air washed clean and the sky a brilliant star-flecked canvas. He swayed in the saddle, weakened by blood loss, with Miguel held securely in front of him, wrapped in his coat and sleeping the sleep of pure exhaustion. A lantern appeared on the porch, a beacon in the darkness. Elena ran toward them, her face a mess of tear tracks and dust. She reached up for her son, her hands trembling as she touched his face, his hair assuring herself he was real. She pulled him from the saddle and crushed him to her, burying her face in his small shoulder, her body shaking with silent, racking sobs of relief. Jack slid from his horse, his legs threatening to buckle. The fiery pain in his side had dulled to a deep, throbbing ache. Elena looked up from her son, her eyes finally falling on the dark stains spreading across Jack's shirt. "Jack, you're hurt." "It's nothing," he rasped, but the world was starting to swim at the edges. She guided him into the house, settling him into a chair by the hearth, before carrying the sleeping Miguel to his bed. When she returned, she had a basin of warm water, clean bandages, and a bottle of whiskey. She worked with a quiet, focused intensity, her touch gentle as she cut away his shirt and cleaned the wound. It was a deep graze, painful and bloody. But the bullet had passed through. As she stitched the wound, closed, her movements deft and practiced, they sat in a profound silence, the weight of the night's revelations hanging between them. The physical pain was nothing compared to the turmoil in Jack's soul. Finally, as she tied off the last bandage, Elena spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Cain." "He's dead," Jack said, his voice hollow. "He told you, didn't he?" she asked softly, her dark eyes full of a deep, sorrowful understanding. "He told you why he did it?" Jack nodded, unable to meet her gaze. He stared into the fire, its flames dancing and shifting like memories. He was Marcus Thorne's brother. He said the name aloud for the first time in 3 years. Then, the words pouring out of him in a torrent of long-suppressed pain, he told her everything. He told her about Eleanor, about her betrayal, about the perfect shining memory that had been a lie. He laid his soul bare, expecting to see pity or disgust in Elena's eyes. Instead, when he finally looked at her, he saw only compassion. "The past is a ghost, Jack," she said, her hand coming to rest on his. "It can haunt you, or you can choose to let it go. The man Cain was trying to destroy. That isn't the man sitting in front of me. That isn't the man who saved my son." He looked down at their joined hands, then into her eyes. "I don't know who I am anymore." He confessed, his voice raw. "Everything I thought was true." "I know who you are," she said with simple, unwavering certainty. You are the man who fought for my ranch when you had no reason to. You're the man who faced down killers to find us water. You are the man who just walked through fire to bring my son home. That is the truth. That is who you are, now." Her words were a balm on his shattered spirit. In the quiet warmth of the kitchen, with the scent of coffee beginning to fill the air and the sound of a child sleeping safely in the next room, Jack Calder began to feel the first tentative stirrings of peace. The devastating truths had not destroyed him. They had, in some strange, painful way, set him free. Free from the ghost of a perfect past that never was, and free to finally see the real, imperfect, and beautiful future that was sitting right in front of him. Months passed. The fierce desert sun of summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The town of Silver Creek, freed from the stranglehold of Silas Kane, slowly began to breathe again. Ranches that had been sold under duress were returned to their rightful owners, the convoluted legal mess untangled by a federal judge who listened rapt to Jack's quiet testimony. Sheriff Brody quietly resigned and drifted out of town, replaced by a younger, more honest man. The fear that had coated the town like dust was swept away by a fresh breeze of hope. At the Three Creeks Ranch, life settled into a new rhythm. The spring Jack and Elena had found now flowed freely down a newly dug channel, turning the parched land green and vibrant. The burned-out barn was cleared away, and the foundation for a new one was laid, a project the whole community turned out to help with. Jack stayed. He worked alongside Elena, the easy partnership they'd forged in survival, deepening into a quiet, steadfast affection. The ghosts of his past still whispered to him in the dark hours of the night, but their voices were growing fainter, drowned out by the sounds of a real life being lived, the laughter of a small boy, the gentle lowing of cattle at dawn, the sound of his name being spoken with love. One clear, cool morning, Jack rode out alone. He traveled for 2 days back east toward the life he had fled. He stopped at a small, windswept cemetery outside Wichita. He stood for a long time before the simple headstone that read, "Eleanor Calder, beloved wife." The woman buried beneath that stone was a stranger to him now, a composite of love and lies of loyalty and betrayal. He no longer felt the sharp, clean agony of grief, but the dull, complicated ache of a truth accepted. He reached into his pocket and took out the silver locket. He looked at the smiling face within for a long moment. Then he gently placed it on the headstone, the silver gleaming against the gray stone. He was letting it all go, the idealized love, the crippling guilt, the years of mourning a woman who never truly existed. He turned and walked away, without looking back. He returned to the ranch as the sun was setting bleeding crimson and gold across the horizon, setting the distant mesas on fire. As he rode into the yard, the door to the house flew open. Miguel came running out, his small legs pumping a wide grin on his face. He launched himself at Jack as he dismounted, wrapping his arms around his legs. "Pa," the boy shouted the word, bright and clear and full of unconscious love. "You're home." Jack froze, the simple word striking him with more force than any bullet ever had. He looked over the boy's head at Elena, who stood on the porch, a soft, knowing smile on her face. Her eyes shone in the fading light, reflecting the promise of a home, of a family, of a future built not on the ghosts of the past, but on the hard-won truths of the present. He knelt, pulling the boy into a fierce, protective embrace. He felt the small, strong heartbeat against his own. This was real. This was true. He had ridden into Silver Creek, seeking a place to die, and instead he had found a reason to live.